Welcome to Coming Clean, the podcast dedicated to common sense environmental dialogue, environmental optimism, and real environmental solutions. This show is proudly powered by Ørsted. Welcome back to Coming Clean with your host, Benji Backer. I am joined by an incredible leader, a thought leader in this space, but also just a guy who is seen as a point of contact on something very, very important, the Inflation Reduction Act, the biggest climate investment in history. His name is Jenkins. He's a professor at Princeton University and has been one of, if not the lead modeler for how to implement the Inflation Reduction Act, not just from a policy perspective, but into communities. And Jesse, first of all, welcome to the show. And I would love for you to share with the listeners here a little bit about yourself and how you got to being involved in this work, but also what that involvement has looked like now that you are in such a prevalent position.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Benji. I'm currently an assistant professor at Princeton. I just wrapped up my fourth year, about to start my fifth year here at the university, where I have a joint appointment at our Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, which is the home for interdisciplinary energy systems research or energy research at the School of Engineering, and the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department. I'm also an affiliated faculty at our School of Public and International Affairs, and so a lot of my work crosses over into public policy as well. That kind of work at the intersection of engineering and public policy as it relates to energy and clean energy particularly is, where my career has really resided. I got my start working on renewable energy policy in Oregon, where I'm from originally, at the state level for a couple of years. Before transitioning to work on federal energy innovation policy for several years at a think tank, where I, felt like I was kind of in a synthesis mode, where my job was to sort of synthesize the best available research and information out there, come up with compelling policy proposals and arguments, and hand those to policymakers to try to move policy development forward. It was a really fun and rewarding kind of place to be, where you can help shape public policy. But the fundamental limitation I kept having there is, if someone hadn't answered the question already in the primary research, I was sort of stuck, right? I was doing secondary work. And so I had to wait for somebody to go figure it out, or, come up with the best, creative bullshit we could, right? At the time, get it as close to right as we could, given the limited information. And so what I wanted to do is, at that point, is to go back to graduate school to learn how to conduct research at that intersection of energy systems and public policy, to try to figure out a set of tools that I could use myself to answer key questions that policymakers or planners or investors or others that were trying to shape our energy transition, we're facing right now, but where there weren't necessarily good, clear answers already or clear consensus, and where I hoped I could try to contribute something to advancing our state of knowledge around those questions. And so I went to MIT for graduate school in technology and policy, a master's program in technology and policy, and then a PhD in engineering systems, both of which are a little bit of choose your own adventure kind of graduate programs at that intersection of policy and engineering or technology. And so for me, what that meant was studying a combination of power systems engineering, optimization methods, so how to set up constrained optimization models, which are very useful to study energy systems, and applied economics, particularly, applied microeconomics and policy. And it was great. It was, excellent place to be for graduate school. And it came out of that with a set of tools, including an energy system model that I built in my dissertation that continued to be a kind of workhorse tool for us here at Princeton, focused on what I call macro scale energy systems. So that's the kind of regional or national scale. I don't design devices, don't design power plants. I think about how the whole grid or the whole regional energy system or national energy system is going to evolve, and how technologies and policies and economic decisions interact at that level. And so we, at my group, which is called the Zero Lab at Princeton, we build, better modeling tools all the time, trying to push our boundaries of what we can do with modeling of macro energy systems. And then we use those tools for kind of two main decision support roles, again, really focused on real world decision making that we can help inform. The first is around technology evaluation to inform innovation policy, investment, and innovation activities themselves, like, trying to understand the role of emerging technologies, develop cost targets and performance goals, help guide resource allocation towards the most valuable innovation activities. And then our energy transitions program, which is focused on very particular jurisdictions, parts of the world, regions or states or countries that have committed to or are exploring commitments to an energy transition. And then we try to model those in greater detail and really try to help identify some of the key roadblocks and barriers and ideally solutions that can help accelerate clean energy transitions in different parts of the world.
Well, I really appreciate what you do because it's based on, facts and reality and science and numbers instead of just, I think for a lot of the energy decisions and it's just, I mean, I guess for a lot of policy discussions these days, it's like we're going to put this policy together, we're going to ask and call for a bunch of things, but we're just kind of hoping that it's going to work out and we're not actually sure. And that's not just like the climate dialogue, that's a lot of dialogues on policy today. And especially at the national level where a lot of these decisions are made, it seems like you're kind of leading from the forefront of being one of the first to put really a holistic view on what we should be doing and why with real, backup to it. Um, One of the first areas that, I've come across your work for years now, but one of the first areas that the world really got to see it at the scale that probably is deserved is on the Inflation Reduction Act. And I would love to just kind of dive into what types of, data and modeling you've been able to create and what that actually looks like in practice. And I think that on the Inflation Reduction Act is probably the best example for us to talk about because it's still so relevant today. But before we dive into kind of what that's looked like from a modeling perspective and how you've helped, can you kind of give, listeners who might know of the Inflation Reduction Act or know a little bit about it, a little bit more context of what it is, the scale of it, just kind of a total overview of the IRA before we go into some details.
Yeah, sure. And so the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the last Congress is really the most substantive piece of climate legislation or clean energy investment in U.S. history. It's a bill that predominantly revolves around a set of grants, tax credits, loan guarantees, and other financial incentives that, as I like to think of it, effectively put clean energy on sale for the American public and for businesses and for industries. It's a set of incentives that lower the relative cost of the clean side of the ledger relative to the dirty side, right? And so the goal there being to shift the millions of myriad decisions that individual households or businesses or utilities or fleet managers or whoever else are making on a regular basis, and shift those decisions so that the cleaner energy option is just the better financial decision, right? It's a better household financial decision, it's a better business decision, it's more profitable for investment, and it does that by effectively subsidizing those cleaner energy options. Now, that's, of course, in marked contrast to the other strategy you could use to shift those decisions, which is to raise the cost of the dirty side of the ledger, right? You could say, we're going to tax carbon pollution or we're going to cap CO2 emissions, as they have in Europe and in California and a few other places, and then limit the amount of emissions that raises the cost of pollution. And that, of course, then makes clean energy relatively more, affordable, but it does so by making fossil energy more expensive. Economists will consistently argue, and I think it's largely true, that's a more cost-efficient route to go down because you really are accurately pricing the damages we're trying to avoid. But of course, it doesn't take a political scientist to know that, raising the cost of energy is not a very popular proposition. And particularly at a moment as the Inflation Reduction Act, came together when, we were already in a rampant period of inflation with very, high energy costs increases in 2021, 2022. And so it really, this strategy of making clean energy cheaper rather than making fossil energy more expensive was really the only viable strategy. And that's effectively what the Inflation Reduction Act does. So it's a, substantive shift in the U.S. policy environment. What it effectively does is it aligns the full might of the federal government, the full financial might of the federal government behind this, clean energy transition. That's necessary, but probably insufficient, right? Because there's a lot of other challenges we have to overcome besides just shifting that economic calculus. But it's, at least a $500 billion package. The official budget score is just shy of $400 billion over 10 years for clean energy programs. But that, of course, is an estimate. And most of the spending or outlays are via tax credits that are not capped. So grant programs have a limited budget. When they're done, they need to go back to Congress to ask for more appropriations. but tax credits don't have any limits. So it depends on how people respond to the credit and how much clean energy they deploy or how many EVs they buy. And so our judgment based on our modeling is that the JCT score, the Joint Committee on Taxation estimate of how much the credits would cost, is probably quite low. And it's only a 10-year period. Many of these credits extend quite a bit beyond that and will have outlays into the 2030s. So, think of it as on the order of a $500 billion public investment that's probably likely to spur somewhere on the order of $2 to $3 trillion in total public and private sector investment, just in the energy supply side of the system, with additional investments in manufacturing and household purchases, like new heating systems or new vehicles. So it's a lot of money, and it needs to be, because this is a huge. We're trying to shift the entire energy system in the country, and that's a huge, huge set of annual expenditures and investments. So the financial incentives have to be large to do the job.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I guess, a couple of critiques that I hear a lot, especially on the right, around these ideas is, first and foremost, that the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't really have to do with inflation, which I've even had a lot of Democratic Congresspeople tell me, it's poorly named. But there's that critique, which honestly doesn't really matter. The real critique, because the naming is just the naming. The real critique that I hear is, okay, yes, it's trying to shift the Overton window from clean energy from being more expensive to clean, but it's using tax dollars to do that. So it's using government money that comes from somewhere. So it's not just making it cheaper for free. But B, this is just a temporary thing, and if the costs of doing clean energy at this scale don't go down, then you're just gonna have to continue to subsidize it. So what would you say to the critics who kind of say those two things, that the the Inflation Reduction Act is picking winners and losers with tax dollars that are already out there, it's not for free, and that if it doesn't work, then you're just kind of back at square one.
Yeah, I would just say, just briefly on the inflation naming, I mean, I think you're right that it largely is immaterially what the bill is named. Although I do want to point out that while the Inflation Reduction Act isn't going to do anything to address this inflation cycle, it does target two of the major cost drivers in the basket of inflation, which is healthcare costs and energy costs. Right. So if you look at what has been driving inflation, it's mostly healthcare, energy, and the cost of housing. Right. It doesn't address housing, but it does help substantially reduce U.S. energy expenditures in the next 5 to 10 year period. And it also included, of course, prescription drug negotiations and the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, extensions for people who get their health insurance from the exchanges. So there is some connection there with inflation. It's maybe going to help with the next inflationary cycle, but probably not so much with this one. I always joke during the development of the bill, once the Build Back Better Act, which is the original House bill, had been killed by Joe Manchin in December of 2021. I kept joking that whatever you need to call it, just call it the Joe Manchin Real American Hero Act of 2022 if that's what you got to do to get it passed, right? And there's a little bit of that element to
Yep.
to this to this marketing, where it was a moment, emerged in a moment when inflation was on the top of everybody's mind, and so that's the way it was framed. Now, in terms of the broader, more substantive critiques, I mean, first I'll take yes, this isn't free. It certainly is not. As I mentioned, this is probably $500 billion or so of federal expenditures. Now, that said, that's $500 billion over 10 or more years. So $50 billion ish on average a year in a federal budget that approaches $5 trillion. So it really is not an enormous drain on the federal coffer, right? We need to have that in perspective. This is not of the scale of the American Rescue Plan or some of the other multi-trillion-dollar 1 or 2 year, spending programs that we passed during the height of the pandemic. This is a prolonged set of investments over a decade or more that on an annual basis are really quite trivial in the scale of the overall federal budget. Second point I would say is that, yes, it's not free, but it's not paid for with general taxation, right? We did not just raise income taxes on everyone. What the way the bill was paid for was two primary measures. One was an increase in the corporate minimum tax, right? So for companies that have been paying well less than their fair share, they now have to pay a minimum corporate tax of 15%. And by increasing IRS enforcement on tax cheats. So if you're not a company that's been avoiding taxes through various loopholes and you're not a tax cheat, you're not paying for the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Someone else, those folks are, and you're getting in exchange cheaper, cleaner energy and more clean energy manufacturing activity and employment in the United States, and a reduction of exposure to fossil fuel, price volatility and price shocks like we've seen over the last few years, and lower public health costs as we clean up our energy system. So those are all, things that I think everyday Americans can appreciate. Whatever your political stripe, right? We all appreciate clean air. None of us want to be part of an energy system, right, where a dictator on the other side of the world can invade his neighbor and start, and drive up the cost of filling up your tank and getting to work the next Monday, by a factor of 2, right? Which is what we saw happen in 2021 and 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine, right? We produce more fossil fuels than we consume here in the United States. We're net exporters of oil, coal, and gas, right? We have achieved physical energy security, and yet we are still highly vulnerable to global commodity shocks and, the global geopolitical risks around the oil and gas trade, as we saw vividly in the last couple of years. And so this bill will help insulate the U.S. economy and households from that kind of vulnerability over time by making more clean energy here in the U.S. from U.S. assets, from U.S. wind and solar and biofuels and nuclear power, and relying less on those globally traded fossil commodities that leave us exposed to price shocks. So, there's a lot of reasons to this benefits Americans, and again, it's paid for by tax cheats and by corporations that have been sidestepping their tax responsibility. So I think that's a pretty good deal in the end. The more substantive one, which I think is a really important one to take on, is the other one you mentioned, which is that, yes, you can make clean energy artificially cheaper with subsidies, but are we just setting ourselves up to be perpetually addicted to subsidies, right? And once those subsidies end, we kind of lose these sectors. And, that's certainly a key concern. And I think that touches on the importance of targeting sectors where we know there are potential for cost reductions and for, emergence of competitive industries over time. And fortunately, that's what we've seen in the past, right? If you take a look at wind or solar or lithium ion batteries, right, which are the major cost component in electric vehicles, as well as our new option for grid storage. 10 years ago, when Congress failed last time to pass climate policy, the Waxman-Markey bill in 2009 and 2010, those technologies cost an order of magnitude more than they cost today. Literally. I mean, wind has come down in cost by about 2/3. Solar and batteries have come down in cost by about 90% since 2010. So they literally cost 10 times as much, a decade ago. And the reason they came down in cost is not just time. It came down in cost because the U.S., through our investment tax credits and production tax credits and RPS policies at the state level, and other countries like China and Germany and others, subsidized their deployment when they were expensive. That drives economies of scale, incremental innovation, and competition that drives down the cost of these technologies steadily and makes them cheaper in real terms, not subsidized terms. And so I think we know that these kinds of subsidies can, in certain circumstances at least, drive down the real cost of technology and make clean energy truly cheap. And that is going to be critical if we want the world to switch to clean energy, because developing emerging economies can't afford to pay a premium for cleaner energy. And so we need to use our money wisely in the US where we can afford it to drive down the cost of clean energy for the rest of the world to adopt. And that's what we're trying to do with this law.
A lot of great stuff to dive into there. One of the first things that I wanted that I want to go back to is the role of kind of fossil fuels in the global marketplace. And you talked about Germany and Russia. Obviously, Russia cutting off natural gas from Germany, or the threat of that has caused a lot of problems for Germany. A lot of people say that that's because there's been a too quick of a return to, or a too quick of a transition to clean energy, and that especially the closure of the coal and natural gas and nuclear plants has led to that reliance on Russian natural gas. From what I've seen, that's fairly stated as a fact across most people who are analyzing that. What would you say to that, and are people looking at it the wrong way?
So I mean, I think that that is largely true in the case of Germany, and our Zero Lab put out a report right, a few months after the crisis, the invasion of Ukraine, pointing out ways that Europe could entirely end its reliance on Russian gas within the year, which many people argued at the time was not possible, and we showed there was actually several different feasible ways you could do that. And, one of the key strategies would have been to stop the planned retirement of nuclear reactors in Germany. It's ludicrous to continue to retire those in an environment when you are importing, continuing to be dependent on imported gas from Russia as they're invading, an ally. And also, to as your households are paying 10x what they used to for heating bills. We even argue that you would need to rely on coal to a greater extent in the short term in the power sector to displace natural gas. That sort of flipped the energy transition on its head, right? The strategy has been use gas as the bridge fuel to get off of coal, and then when when you're done, then you start phasing down gas. That's what we're doing largely in the U.S. Germany was doing the same thing. We argued that temporarily you wanted to invert that priority because even though coal was more polluting and higher emitting, obviously the war in Ukraine changed the relative strategic importance of displacing gas first and then coal. So I think there's some fair, points to be made on Germany's sense of priority and how that got them in a particular vulnerability. But let's remember, this is not just about Germany. I mean, take a country like the UK that has been, even more successful at reducing their emissions, and as developing a large nuclear industry, has kept and retained its natural gas plants, has phased out coal plants, but those were highly uncompetitive and old as well. The whole of Europe was just as vulnerable to these types of shocks, and in fact, even the United States, where we're net exporters of natural gas, saw natural gas prices go from $2 or $3 a MMBTU to $7, $8 because of the pressure of LNG exports on domestic markets, even though we're not fully coupled with the world market. And then, remember, there's gas and then there's oil, and we're all addicted to oil, right? The entire economy runs on oil, whether it's Germany or the United States. And the only way to really get ourselves free of that economic vulnerability is to shift more to electric vehicles, and to rely on American-made electricity instead of oil. Electricity isn't traded as a global commodity. Right? We don't have to worry about what's going on in Ukraine when we think about pricing of electricity here in the U.S., especially renewable and nuclear electricity. Whereas oil, even though we are net exporters, our oil price is still fundamentally linked to the global market and to global national security, global security threats around the world, and that's not going to change until we can switch away from oil as the primary fuel of our economy. So yeah, there's a bunch of challenges there, but I think, and they're not going to we're not going to solve it overnight, right? Our economy is not going to transition overnight away from these fuels. Even in crisis, Europe has had a hard time moving quickly away from Russian imports, and they've largely had to rely on imports of fossil fuels from friendly countries like the U.S. to do that. So I have no illusions about how long this will take to happen, but we got to start making progress, right? We've been talking about this for my entire lifetime,
Right.
and it's time to start making some progress.
No, I completely agree, and that's why I think us starting to signal a move in this direction is so important, and we'll get into more of the kind of real opportunities there are with this in a second. But one of the other critiques that I hear a lot, especially about what you were just saying about the United States being less reliant on the global market for oil and gas and less dependent on that just from the national security perspective, but also from the energy reliability perspective, is if we shift to solar and wind so quickly, we're not really changing that. We're actually making it worse because China and Russia, Russia with uranium and nuclear, China for almost all the materials for wind and solar, over 90% of the minerals, mined for a lot of these clean energy sources come from China. We're actually just giving our power over to China because we can't do that same thing here. And yes, we can take back, maybe 10, 20% of it, but that China, has that market cornered. And that's not a reason not to shift to that, but to rely so heavily on solar and wind when they could cut us off at any point. Uh,
Yep.
what's the plan there?
Yeah, no, those are great questions and common concerns. Look, there's a fundamental difference between being reliant on materials inputs for durable manufactured goods and being reliant on imports for a fuel that you light on fire and consume every day, right? So you need gas to power your vehicle every day. If the gas goes away or it triples in cost, you're fundamentally vulnerable on a daily basis. You only need the materials inputs when you're building the thing for the first time. After that, the nuclear plant, the wind farm, the solar farm, it's going to keep producing power once it's installed. And so, yeah, it may be that we get to a point where, God forbid, we're in a global conflict with China, those supply chains are disrupted, and some of our factories have to idle for producing new wind farms or new solar panels or new EVs. But all the ones continually operating that we built already that are in the field, regardless of where the minerals came from that went into them, those are going to be there providing fundamental energy security for the United States on an ongoing basis. It's just different, right? We're talking about a durable asset that lasts for decades versus a fuel that you consume all the time. So that's the first point. The second is that there is no fundamental reason to believe that we can't compete with China or that our allies can't compete with China for these supply chains. China is not fundamentally blessed with the resource endowment for this. In fact, most of the minerals that they use, they process in China, but import from elsewhere, right? So they import cobalt from the Congo or they import nickel from Russia and they process it in China. That's a more value-added step in the process. And then they use it in manufacturing of components, right? As the sort of factory of the world. That is not an accident. That is a deliberate outcome of strategic policy in China to subsidize the growth of these industries over the last decade. The United States basically sat on the sidelines and let China do that. That we ceded that competitive market, that strategically important set of markets to China. We didn't have to do that. I was arguing in 2012 that we should be redoubling our efforts to compete with China because we saw them doing this then, right? We saw this in their 5-year plans. We saw this in their post, I should say even 2010, in their post-recession stimulus plans in 2010. The U.S. just didn't compete. And we can make a different choice now. In fact, that's what the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law do. They focus very centrally on onshoring and friendshoring, right? Ensuring our allies produce these materials and goods. And so for the first time, we now have direct subsidies for manufacturing of wind, solar, electric vehicle batteries, and critical minerals here in the U.S. We have domestic content bonuses for wind and solar farms that buy American. We have buy clean provisions that help us buy clean materials in the federal government. We have loan guarantees at the loan programs office that can help us retool automotive manufacturing and EV battery manufacturing here in the U.S. And we have a bunch of grant programs in the bipartisan infrastructure law focused on battery recycling, critical minerals production, et cetera. So, we basically in the last 2 years decided, game on, China, we're going to compete. And I fundamentally believe the American people and the American business community can compete in this environment. So, I don't want us to be defeatist about this. Yes,
Right.
We did seed the last decade, but the next decade is ours. And, that there's no reason why we can't, with the right policy environment, compete with China.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and that I like the idea of onshoring and friendshoring. I like that word as well. I was at COP in Glasgow in 2021 and had to miss last year because of some health issues. But in 2021, we were talking literally about that same thing, and it was a year before the IRA, which is basically how can we work with our allies to create the clean energy materials that we need, and obviously this policy helped kind of accelerate that, which is great. One of the other real concerns here, though, is the last episode that I had on Coming Clean was about, or one of the last episodes was about kind of mining in Arizona, and I've been I've been seeing time and time again the opportunity to mine for these clean energy materials blocked for honestly real fair reasons. I come from the Midwest, Boundary Waters, and up in northern Minnesota is a place that has been very controversial to mine in. Nevada with some of the Native American tribes, and that's also true in other states. In Arizona, being 10, 15 miles from the Grand Canyon. A lot of these reserves of these materials, not just in the United States, but worldwide, are in these areas that are fairly, vulnerable, or they're controversial. If we're not a China that doesn't really care about that and doesn't really care about the human rights side of it, doesn't care about the environmental, like actual physical landscape of destroying the environment to mine, if we're going to have those standards for ourselves and try to work with tribes and work with human rights standards and not try to destroy the boundary waters, how the heck do we ever get to a place where we can compete with them?
Well, I think that it's going to take time to build up our, supply chains and our manufacturing base. But I'm like, we need to be having a national conversation about this. Like, you want to drive an EV? Do you want that battery to come from, artisanal miners, meaning child labor in the Congo, processed in China? Or do you want it to be coming from, a U.S. owned mine in Australia, processed in Arizona or wherever it is, right?
Uh-huh.
Under our labor standards and our, environmental standards and, built by allied countries. I just, we have to cross this bridge now. And, there's a broader challenge across all of this, which is that, we're trying to rebuild the entire energy infrastructure of this country, right? That's the challenge of an energy transition. And, look, we're both of a generation where we've never seen an infrastructure project like this in the United States. We built our modern infrastructure, right, from the New Deal era through maybe the 1970s, right? And then we kind of stopped and we've barely maintained what we have, right? We've got infrastructure falling apart all over the country. We struggle to upgrade it or maintain it or, widen the highways or whatever. But, when's the last time you saw a new interstate highway go in or a new long distance transmission line or a new manufacturing hub, in different parts of the country? And so, the reality is we are going to have to try to address this as a country and build support for the idea that we are embarking on a national project that has real national significance, that has benefits for communities all over the country, that strengthens our national security and our energy security, that finally, after decades of talking about it, brings manufacturing back to the United States. And to do that, we're going to have to build some stuff.
Right.
We're going to have to mine some stuff. We're going to have to process some stuff. This is not a digital industry. This is a physical industry with, materials and equipment and manufactured goods and big infrastructure. And I don't know, on some level, I find that exciting. And I hope that other people do too, right? The idea that we are on a nation building project again, that is going to, build benefits and long-term prosperity for our country for another generation. That's the kind of thing I hope that if we can start having broader conversations about, help people understand what's going on here, that people can get excited about the idea of building big, important things in America. That's the kind of thing that animates Americans of all stripes. It shouldn't, this isn't some liberal fantasy or anything. Like this is how we build might in America, right? This is how we build economic opportunity. So yeah, that I think you're right to point to, like, it's harder to build a mine in Nevada. Probably good that it's harder to build a mine in Nevada than China, but that doesn't mean it should be impossible to build a mine in Nevada.
Well, and that's where, like, the NIMBYism does come into play, and that's, I applaud environmental activists for a lot of things, but one of the areas where I feel like there's a real misalignment is the fact that there's a demand for these sorts of materials, but then no one wants them to be done here in the United States. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. We're going to pretend that it's prettier and better somewhere else than if it was in our own backyards, but it's actually worse than what would be in our own backyards.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges is, like, if you're looking at any individual project, it's always easier to envision some hypothetical better project that could happen theoretically. But if you say no everywhere, then there's no projects, right? And so I do think we need to think creatively, and the, policy community on both sides of the aisle should be thinking very creatively about different institutional structures, different procedural structures, where we can move from an environment where we're talking about, multiple points of veto for an individual project, right? That's how things happen now. You propose a mine, you have to go through like 6 or 8 or 12 different individual processes, any one of which could veto it. And you have to succeed on all of them at once to get through the process, right? To get a project built. And the onus is on the developer and their private motivation or, profit motivation to get that done. If we're talking about rebuilding the energy infrastructure of our country because it's in the national interest, we really should be thinking about, how do we build a sufficient number of facilities of a certain type, right? How do we get enough lithium? How do we get enough nickel? How do we get enough solar manufacturing, enough EV assembly? And, you have to succeed in that. You have to allocate those resources somewhere. And so if you say no here, then find another spot somewhere else. And we don't have the institutions that do that, right? That have to do that shifting, right? Where if somebody says no here, we got to find another location where we can, say yes. And we can help the people understand the trade-offs that they're creating when they say no to an individual project. Maybe that's idealistic. I don't know exactly what the format is for some of those procedures, but it's a little bit like how we approach winning a war, right? Like if we need a certain number of factories, we just need a certain number of factories. Let's figure out where to put them. And it's not, you say yes or no to each individual factory. You may not build in every place you might have thought, right? There are certain areas that we're going to want to protect and areas where communities are not welcoming at all, but you got to build somewhere. And we need institutions and processes that can make sure that building at scale actually succeeds. So I do worry that this is one of critical weaknesses at this point. It's something that the Inflation Reduction Act certainly doesn't address. And neither does simply streamlining NEPA or other, permitting reforms like that. This demands more creativity and more expansive thinking, I think, to figure out
Well,
how
and
we're going to tackle those challenges.
cultural as well, to be okay with
Yeah,
it.
and cultural thinking.
Especially with community buy-in and realizing that those jobs are important, and you also, don't want to export this somewhere else where, again, the standards are lower and the economic output is going to be far worse for Americans and our communities. Um, Kind of one last critique to go through that I think I'd like to get your thoughts on is, and this is something that I really believe, which is that there's a too heavy of a focus in the climate space on just EVs, solar, and wind. There are so many different opportunities out there with transportation, whether it's hydrogen, hybrids, things that we haven't even thought of yet. On energy, there's obviously geothermal, there's nuclear, there's hydro, there's more efficiency for natural gas that we could work on, especially around methane. Sustainable agriculture is obviously huge. Food waste is huge. Um, Restoring ecosystems is huge. It seems like the climate conversation, including with the IRA, even though there was a little bit of sustainable agriculture and a few other things, is so hyper focused on solar, wind, and EVs. And I personally believe in everything that I've read and researched that is a short-sighted thing, because you can't put all your eggs in those baskets. Not even if they work out 100% to what we would like, it still wouldn't fix the problem to the level that we need. So what what do you think about the focus of the IRA and the conversation being so heavily around those kind of siphoned items? And do you agree that we need to broaden that in future policy discussions and in the narrative right now?
So I think I would agree that in certain environmental circles, there is a overwhelming focus on on the sort of soft energy path solutions, as Amory Lovins would put it, right? Like small scale wind and solar, energy conservation and efficiency, electric efficient vehicles. These are the sort of preferred solutions. Um, I I think that if you look at what's actually in the Inflation Reduction Act, it does not reflect that worldview. Right. I mean, this is a bill that Joe Manchin championed in the end, right? And it reflects that as well. It is really an all clean energy of the above, right? Not all of the above necessarily, but all low carbon options. And it really touches on everything, maybe not to the fullest degree in certain areas like agriculture, where again, you mentioned there's some grant funding in this bill in IRA for sustainable agriculture practices and things like that. There's USDA funding for bioenergy and fuel infrastructure and things like that, but they're relatively limited. The Farm Bill reauthorization is coming up, maybe an opportunity to tackle some of that either now or in the future. But if you look broadly, I mean, the bulk of the work in the next decade when it comes to emissions reductions is going to come from wind, solar, and batteries, not because they're the environmentalist favorite, but because they're the most mature, cleanest technologies in the portfolio today. That wasn't an accident. They're mature today because we supported them a decade and beyond ago when they were expensive alternative energy technologies. We drove their scale up in innovation and improvement and got people comfortable financing them. And now they're, ready to do the work of large scale decarbonization. The challenge is to do that same, proactive work for the next wave of solutions. And IRA does a pretty darn good job of that, right? If you're talking about other carbon-free electricity sources like nuclear or geothermal, it, for the first time, extends the production and investment tax credits to any carbon-free electricity generation option, including new nuclear, for the first time at the same value as is available for wind and solar. It provides technology-neutral tax credit for low-carbon hydrogen production, technology-neutral tax credit for low-carbon fuels production. It explicitly saves the entire existing nuclear fleet by subsidizing ongoing operations of our existing reactors. It dramatically extends the tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, storage, and direct air capture. So, pretty much across the board, it provides the first commercial deployment subsidies, as well as often some early demonstration funding, particularly in the infrastructure law, for the pretty much the full portfolio of solutions. There's a couple things that maybe got left out of there, but it is a very broad bill that reflects the need to take a set of technologies that are less mature than they need to be today, drive their early commercial deployment so that in the 2030s, they're really ready for the same scale of use and the same heavy lifting that wind and solar and EVs are going to do over the next decade. And if we can pull that, tango off, right, the two-step, right, deploy wind solar batteries now, accelerate the maturity of the next generation of technologies for the 2030s, we can get this job done quite cost effectively, quite securely, quite reliably. But we have to be proactive because wind and solar and batteries will reach a limitation, right? They can't do all the work. And so as we scale them up, they're going to get, decreasing marginal benefit and, diminishing returns. And we need to be ready to step in with carbon capture, with advanced nuclear, with advanced geothermal, with, with fuel cell trucks for long distance freight, hydrogen supply for industrial processes. These other technologies we're going to need in the 2030s. And the good news is, together, the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, for the first time, really provide us with that kind of comprehensive technology policy suite.
I completely agree, and I like what I like about what you just said is there's just that acknowledgement that it's going to take more than these sources of technology, but kind of getting them to that final, most important step of deployment is critical to just see what the capacity and scale could be at the level that's needed, and then also investing in the next generation of technologies. I think partially the IRA focused heavily on it, in my opinion, maybe a little bit too heavily on those and not on other areas. But to your point, it did focus on other areas, but that's not what's talked about necessarily in the media narrative or anything, because it's also harder to explain. What you just said is harder to explain than solar, wind, EVs, which is on the top of everyone's mind because your point, it's been around for decades and people have kind of had that baked into their mind. Quickly moving to a different topic for a second. Conservatives obviously were not really part of this discussion. Obviously, I lean right of center and run ACC. It was a very partisan process, and it was done in a very partisan way, and both sides are to blame for that, in my opinion. But it's over now, right? And hopefully moving forward, that doesn't have to be the case. What would you say to conservatives who are skeptical of this policy to say, this is just going to benefit the urban elites and this is going to only benefit, Democrat communities and it's meant to pick winners and losers for their pet projects and all of that? From my understanding, there's a lot of investment that goes into conservative communities. There's a lot of opportunity for rural communities to have buy-in here. However, they don't want to just be told what to do and thrown money at, right? That doesn't really work either. So what would you say to conservatives who are skeptical, and how does this policy, the Inflation Reduction Act, actually engage with these communities that might be skeptical of it, and what should they know?
So I guess I would say first that, the broad kind of suite of technology solutions that are supported by this law, again, extend well beyond those that are the favorites of urban liberals and reflect the bipartisan consensus that was built in the infrastructure law, right? So if you look at the infrastructure law, basically does demonstration funding for the full suite of technologies, right? It's got advanced nuclear demonstrations, carbon capture hubs, hydrogen hubs, critical minerals recycling and processing, those kinds of things, but just for demonstration stage. What IRA does is it takes that same commitment to those technologies and it extends it to commercial deployment through tax credits. And again, I think that's a reflection, honestly, of a fairly broad bipartisan group of technology policy focused advocacy groups that engaged heavily throughout the process of both shaping IRA and the earlier Build Back Better Act and the infrastructure law. And together they kind of complete the package of technology policy for carbon capture, for advanced nuclear, for hydrogen, et cetera, for other technologies that are not high on the list of priorities for California liberals. And so I do think it's a bit broader than people realize, even though it did pass on a bipartisan basis. The ideas that it reflects and the kinds of industries it supports are a bit broader than might be expected. And that's maybe not so surprising when you think that Joe Manchin was the median voter, right, who represents a state that is, plus 60 Republican, right, in the presidential election. So he may caucus with the Democrats, but he's got a viewpoint that I think aligns with many conservative voters. the second thing I say is if you look at the distribution of benefits, as you alluded to, this isn't just picking pet projects in urban areas, right, or democratic districts. In fact, you look at where the manufacturing investments are going, where the bulk of wind and solar and hydrogen and CO2, capture investments are going, bioenergy investment, it's almost all in Republican districts and states. In fact, so much so that some of the Democrats who voted for it are getting quite frustrated that all the benefits are going to the Republicans who didn't vote for it, right? Or the districts of the Republicans who didn't vote for it. Personally, I think that's great. I think that having a set of energy policies that broadly benefits communities across the country, particularly those that have been left behind by the last 30 years of economic policy, which, let's be frank, right, was bipartisan, right? Extends from Reagan through, through
Right.
Clinton, through on to through Obama, which was a policy focused on low taxes, offshoring of manufacturing, global trade and low tariffs, and the financialization of our economy. And what did that get us? What that got us was tech hub cities like Seattle and San Francisco and others, and financial cities like New York that were booming, and tech industries and financial sectors that boomed in those very few cities in the country. And we left the rest of the country behind in terms of our economic policy,
Yep.
right? To struggle through that whole period. And to see retail get decimated by Amazon, and to see offshoring and manufacturing, and to see, the smartest, talented kids leave those communities and go to those cities, right?
Yep.
And what we're seeing finally with the infrastructure law, with the CHIPS and Science Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, broadly with the sort of re-embrace of industrial strategy or industrial policy, is an economic agenda that just pushes that whole ideology aside and says, you know what? We are going to pick industries that, not winners, we're going to pick strategic industries, right? Not technologies, but whole sectors that we know are important for our country's future, like advanced semiconductors, like clean transportation, like clean energy. And we're going to ensure that we are going to lead the world in those industries, and that we're going to manufacture technologies in the US, and that we're going to deploy investment and economic opportunity across communities all over the country. And I hope that as those benefits start to materialize in real people's communities, right, all over the country, that we start to see that we actually have a federal policy for once in a long time, right, for the first time really in my lifetime, that is starting to unite communities across the country, right, that is delivering economic benefits to red states and blue states alike, that it's delivering clean energy, which makes liberals happy, that's delivering manufacturing jobs and economic opportunity in communities that makes everybody happy, regardless of your political stripe. And I think if we let this law have a chance to do that, we give it another 2 to 4 years to roll this money out, we're going to start to see the politics of this shift around the economic geography of this law, which very much is bipartisan, even if those who voted for it were Democrats.
Yeah, and like we said, it was a very partisan process from the get-go, just because of the nature of it. We don't need to go into all of that, but there were reasons for both sides to be incredibly partisan about it. But you're right, the money does go into these conservative Republican communities by and large, and as I've traveled across the country to meet with a lot of them to understand why they're so skeptical of this dialogue, hopefully this can start to change it. But the proof is in the actions, right? It's not in the words. And hopefully over the next few years, as things are implemented from this policy, they get to see the ramifications of that in real life. One of the things, in the few minutes that we have left here, that has been a huge part of the conversation and really put you on the map again for this, was the permitting reform side of things, and the reality that most or a large chunk of this money that's being deployed really doesn't matter if we can't reform the permitting process. Can you talk through kind of what your work has looked like on that? Well, why
Sure.
that's a reality, and then what your work has looked like on that, where you see that heading.
Yeah. So again, what the Inflation Reduction Act does, and again, this partly reflects the limitations of the budget reconciliation process that, it passed under, right, which really only allows the bill to deal with spending and revenue. So it can't do things like permitting reform or create new institutions like I was talking about earlier. It's just, you can't do that, or you got to have 60 votes to pass. And as you mentioned, there wasn't an opportunity for that kind of bipartisan consensus on this law. So it is limited to changing financial incentives. Money's powerful, right? Financial incentives are really important to shift people's decision making. We can't, expect that businesses or households are going to embrace cleaner energy just because it's altruistic, right? They're going to do it when it makes reasonable financial sense. And so what the law does is it changes the financial calculus, and it really does make financial sense. Like, The cheapest way to get new energy now is just going to be from clean energy. The cheapest vehicle you're going to be able to buy or lease is going to be an EV. It's just going to be the option for that makes best financial sense for people. Now that's necessary again, but not sufficient, right? Because if a project is super profitable but can't get the permits to get built, it can't get built, and it can't deliver clean energy, and it can't reduce our exposure to oil markets, and it can't claim the tax credits. And so what we looked at in our modeling, the repeat project, which I guess I forgot to introduce earlier, which is our effort to use our macro energy system models to try to understand the impacts of these incredibly complicated, and diverse bills, or expansive bills. We plug in all the policies that we can figure out how to model into our models, and we look at how the energy system evolves given that intervention. And what we see is really, unprecedented rates of construction, right? That kind of physical build out that I mentioned earlier, smashing record rates of deployment of wind and solar every year, building new manufacturing facilities to scale up industries at a record pace, expanding our transmission infrastructure at about 50% faster than we have over the last decade. That's just the reality that if you want to take full advantage of the law, you've got to build lots of stuff. And that can only happen if certain other non-financial roadblocks or speed limits or barriers can be overcome. And that includes the permitting processes, but other bureaucratic procedures like interconnection to the regional transmission grids, which isn't strictly federal permitting, but is another kind of bureaucratic process that has really been an impediment to connecting new wind and solar resources or batteries to the grid. As well as, expanding supply chains and material sourcing and things like that. So those all take time. And so, now we have a new set of challenges. I think in many ways it's good that we're talking about this stuff now. We wouldn't have needed to talk about permitting reform if we didn't have the financial incentives to build stuff. So you got to do one to really have to worry about the other. But now we should be thinking about how do we expand the workforce for these industries? How do we, ensure that we're permitting enough, mines and minerals processing facilities? How do we ensure that we are able to build transmission fast enough and across interregional boundaries that are really hard bureaucratically right now because of the way we do permitting and siting at a mostly local level for transmission? And we certainly shouldn't be adding unnecessary bureaucracy anywhere in that system if we want to move quickly to take advantage of these laws. So that's the next frontier, right? The next set of challenges. And what we found, just as an example of that, is if we can't build transmission any faster than we have over the last decade, we could lose somewhere on the order of half of the emissions reductions that the Inflation Reduction Act would otherwise deliver. That's simply because we just can't build wind and solar if you can't expand transmission to connect them to the grid and to bring that power to where people need it. And so we'll be driving our EVs and, switching to our heat pumps or whatever else on the other side of the equation and driving up demand for electricity without the ability to meet that demand and drive down our use of natural gas and coal at the same time. And so, that's a recipe for much higher emissions and much higher air pollution that I hope we can avoid.
Well, and on that note, kind of my final question, and I think we all agree that we need the permitting reform, and I think it's a lot easier said than done, as I've been behind the scenes with a lot of these lawmakers that have very different views on what that looks like, but very clear that we need it for the sake of this issue. But is there another, as we're looking ahead towards, potential, whether that's in 4 years, 10 years, or 2 years, another climate policy, where do you see, outside of the implementation of this and the permitting reform and the kind of just trying to get this done in practice, where do you see this policy making conversation going, and where would you want policymakers to put their attention towards from a climate perspective now that this is behind us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably 4 big gaps that, need further policy action. And honestly, to be frank, need a lot of policy ideation. So for those young policy wonks out there listening, get your thinking caps on, because we need good ideas. And I've seen a dearth of good ideas out there in these areas. So the 4, I think, are, permitting and planning, I should say. So it's not just permitting, but it's also that, where is that vision coming from about the need to build a certain amount of factories, a certain amount of sourcing of minerals, a certain amount of new transmission. We need somebody or some institutions that have at least a regional, if not national, perspective, because this is a national project. We're trying to do things at a new scale here, and we need to succeed. And that's going to require some planning functions that isn't the Communist Party's 5-year plan, but is a way of coordinating the visions of industry and communities and federal tools that we have in the toolkit to make sure that we can build and permit infrastructure at the scale that we need. So that's the first area. The second, I think, it's workforce development and training. One of the titles that got entirely stripped out of the Build Back Better Act when it became the Inflation Reduction Act was the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee title, HELP title, which had all the workforce programs in it. So, here we are in full employment with, rapidly growing strategically important industries from semiconductors to clean energy to advanced manufacturing, and no federal role at the moment in helping ensure we staff those industries well. How are we going to do that, right? Where are the million new tradespeople that we need to staff these industries going to come from, and everything else. And so, again, the private sector can address a lot of that, but we've historically had, important federal training programs and public-private partnerships across the economy that are important for workforce development. And then the last two are the two sectors, the major emitting sectors that are least addressed by IRA, which are agriculture and industry. So IRA does a great job at accelerating the decarbonization of transportation and power generation, which are our number 1 and 2 emitting sectors. But numbers 3 and 4 are not that much smaller. They're each about a fifth of our emissions, and that's industry and agriculture. And there's a little bit of funding, tens of billions-ish for each of those industries in the Inflation Reduction Act. But much of it's focused on demonstrations or, is funding limited that's going to run out fairly quickly. And we really don't have any comprehensive policy strategy for cleaning up either industry or agriculture. And so we need to think about the best way to do that. They're different sectors. Both of them are distinct from each other. They're very different from power. They're very different from transportation and buildings. Industries have, an incredible amount of variation across industrial facilities. There's no cookie cutter solution. A lot of them are trade exposed, very price sensitive industries. So have to be very careful not to disadvantage American producers when we try to clean up these sectors. And agriculture is a whole diverse set of, sectors and players as well that need to be addressed in a creative way. So I think we could see another round of policymaking in, 2 years or 4 years that address those 4 areas. Planning and permitting, workforce development, industrial decarbonization, and agricultural decarbonization. And luckily we bought ourselves a few years of progress, I think, from IRA that, that conversation can unfold over a little while. The permitting is probably the most urgent of those. But we are going to need to do more and address those kinds of questions too.
Well, Jesse, I really appreciate your insight on all this. And I think, the audience, the listeners here are really going to appreciate kind of this deep dive on the IRA and also your work on it. I know we could talk for hours about it. And I know you have, probably days worth of content to talk about in terms of your own research and modeling. I know people should and can follow you on Twitter or X, I guess it is now, where you post a lot of your papers and a lot of the data and a lot of modeling. Is there a better way for people to follow you? Tell us about that.
Yeah, for the Repeat project, which is our ongoing evaluation of federal policy, we're in the process right now of evaluating the proposed EPA regulations on tailpipes and vehicle tail emissions and power plants and other rules like that. So that'll be coming out probably in October-ish timeframe. So keep an eye at repeatproject.org. You can also access a data portal that gives quantitative, results for all of our modeling to date across different scenarios, compare them with benchmarks, and slice and dice them at the state or sectoral level as well. So if you want to take a deep dive on the data, it's all there along with our most recent report, Climate Progress in the 117th Congress, which details impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law that passed last Congress. We're going to launch a Zero Lab website soon, but we don't have one yet. I'm in the process of writing copy for it at the moment, actually. So keep an eye out for that. But for now, you can find me on Twitter and follow me there, or connect on LinkedIn as well. It's post updates on that as well.
Well, Jesse, thanks again for joining. Your work on this is much appreciated. And again, we need a lot more data and science behind the decisions that we're making to protect the science that we all know we need to start taking action on. And you've been doing that for the last few years in a way that no one else has been. So thanks for taking the time to join this podcast, this show, and also for your work in general, and excited to continue the conversation and continue hopefully working in alignment over the years to come.
Thanks, Benji. And yeah, thanks for driving the conversation on this. It's important.
Awesome, thanks. And before we jump, the Coming Clean podcast is grateful to be powered by Ørsted, a wonderful company strengthening America's energy security with reliable and domestic clean energy. Through its integrated renewable energy solutions, Ørsted is creating American jobs, investing in American communities, and driving American innovation, all while preserving our country's natural habitats. A clean energy future truly connects us all, and Ørsted is helping lead the charge. To learn more, visit us.orsted.com.